Well, I feel as though I'm tempting fate here, because the last time I was here, I actually was talking at one of these evening conversations about Jefferson and Hamilton, and I really thought I would be struck by lightning. And I obviously came close this evening, I suppose. But I'm here twice, at least to mention Hamilton on the lawn of Monticello. What I'd actually like to do is, as Dan was saying, just really give you a sense of the project that now I'm on the way towards completing. I'm revising the last chapter, and pretty much by the end of the summer, I'm hoping to submit it. So it's pretty much near completion. And it is the project that grew out of my dissertation that I did here when I was working towards my PhD. And basically what I'm doing is I'm really trying to get a sense of the logic of how national politics worked in the early republic, in the first decade or two that the government was in existence, prior to the existence of institutionalized national parties. So the premise of what I'm doing is, well, what if we actually believe the founding generation, who did not believe that they were in parties and did not consider themselves in a party system? As a matter of fact, they didn't think parties were a very good thing at all. But what if we believe them and essentially throw the word and idea of party out the window and just examine the politics of the period with a fresh eye? Not assuming anything, not assuming any organization, just really looking at how they are behaving and what they are saying about their politics, and trying to get a sense of the logic of how it works. And in doing this, what I discovered was that basically this is a whole population of gentlemen politicians. This is the political elite of the country that was in national politics in the first decade or two. And so logically enough, in the absence of fighting teams, political parties are really essentially fighting teams, and a lot of rules come along with them. In the absence of all of those assumptions, they were really fighting according to the code of honor, the rules of honor, which is how any gentleman would fight with any other gentleman anyway, political or not. So part of what I'm showing in my dissertation is, well, if you understand honor, then you actually understand the politics in a very different kind of a way. And so the book actually traces out their arsenal of political weapons, the way that they understood how you fight or respond to being attacked. I call it a grammar of political combat. And basically every chapter focuses on a weapon of combat and shows you how it was used, what it shows you about the politics of the period, and because every chapter sort of uses one politician and one text as a way to get you into this weapon, the logic of this weapon, it also shows you something about individual founders as well. So actually equal time, Jefferson gets a chapter and Hamilton gets a chapter, so no favoritism here, and John Adams as well. And Aaron Burr actually finishes off the book. I'll come back to him in a minute, actually. But let me just give you a very brief sense of what story I'm telling in the outline of the book. I'll start actually with Jefferson. I'll give him first run here. The chapter that deals with Thomas Jefferson actually talks about political gossip, which, to my surprise, when I began looking at the letters of this founding generation, these national politicians, I discovered that not only were they gossiping all the time, but they were very conscious of it, and they seemed to be following rules. Like you could gossip about some things but not others, and there were certain ways in which you could drop information. They called it dropping and collecting, were their words for this process of dealing with political gossip. So the idea was really intriguing to me, and when I began thinking about it, lo and behold, it occurred to me that Thomas Jefferson recorded every piece of political gossip he ever heard when he was Secretary of State, and he collected them all together into a volume which, when his papers were published, was titled The Annus. So essentially, I had this wonderful gossip log that Thomas Jefferson provided me with that I could analyze and interpret and really get a sense of what it was these people were saying about each other and what it was they hoped to accomplish by saying it. So Thomas Jefferson is my way of basically explaining political gossip. I don't know if he'd be particularly happy about that distinction, but he does a wonderful job of really showing what politicians were doing at their dinner tables. In the case of Jefferson, part of what you discover when you really look at this politics of gossip and what's happening at their dinner tables, you discover that he was a dinner table politician. That is where he shined. That was really the way he accomplished a lot of what he attempted to do as a politician throughout his political career. He was a master of dinner table politicking. Not only did he know how to set the stage perfectly. He was known for having wonderful wines and the best food, French, of course. So people enjoyed having dinner with him. But he also really knew how to set the stage so that conversation would turn, and that's his word, turn towards key topics that happened to be perhaps on the agenda for Congress in the next week. So, for example, he talks about, and what's wonderful is he records in great detail all of his dinners and every little piece of information people drop for him. He talks about, in one case, a dinner where he just happened to invite the key congressmen who were about to vote on the question of whether Congress should refer matters to Alexander Hamilton and seek his advice, which is something that they had been doing for a while up until that point. Clearly, this is not something that Thomas Jefferson was very happy about, and he thought, well, if I can cut that off at the root, I can cut off a lot of Hamilton's power and a lot of problems are going to be solved. So lo and behold, he has a dinner party, and he invites over the key congressmen whose votes are sort of on the fence, and they have an entire dinner in which they say nothing about politics. They talk about everything else. They talk about the city, they talk about France, they talk about whatever else. He normally would set out little things on the table that would sort of strike people into having some kind of an interesting moment of conversation. So they traveled along those lines, and at the end of the evening, somehow or other, he managed to get these 3 key congressmen to stay at the table. And as he put it, the conversation turned to congressional referendum to the Secretary of the Treasury. And as it magically turned in this direction, he let it be known that he thought this was a very bad thing. And after they left, he wrote on a little tiny slip of paper. Those of you who have seen Jefferson's handwriting, he has this sort of very neat, meticulous, very small handwriting when he wants it to be, and in this case he did. Little slip of paper, and he wrote each guy's name, and he wrote what the guy thought about congressional referendums, and they all agreed with him and said, bad, it's a bad thing. So he watched them, he tracked them, and every time the issue came up in Congress or a related issue came up, he'd go back to that same sheet of paper, and he'd record what these 3 particular gentlemen did in relation to it. And ultimately, when it wasn't defeated, and Hamilton maintained that ability to refer, to suggest to Congress basically what he was doing was suggesting legislation, he recorded why this had fallen through, who had fallen through, who had not stayed true to the cause that they'd essentially vouched for at his dinner party. It's an amazing little piece of paper that he records this on, but it really shows you how important these dinner parties were. So Jefferson talks about political gossip. The next chapter will not be a surprise. Basically, Alexander Hamilton talking about dueling. Not surprising at all. It's pretty much the most famous thing he did was duel and die. And essentially the chapter on dueling is titled Dueling as Politics. Because when I really began to look at national politicians and how they were dueling with each other, when were duels breaking out, who challenged who and why, what did the timing have to do with elections, I discovered, surprisingly, that most political duels between national politicians broke out just after an election. It wasn't what I expected. I thought in all the flurry of preparing for an election, people would insult each other and there'd be dueling all over the place. But no, actually after elections, usually the person who lost or one of his particular friends, their words, would challenge either the winner or one of the winner's particular friends. And essentially what they were doing was their reputation was smashed. They felt dishonored at losing an election, a democratic election. So to redeem their reputations, they used honor and dueling to sort of bolster themselves up so that they could prove that they were as worthwhile and had as much merit as the people who won the election. So they're really deliberately provoking duels with each other to redeem their reputations and keep themselves in the circle of political power. It's an amazing thing once you understand the process. There are a number of code words that they would use to deliberately provoke someone into a duel. You insult someone in this particular way, and basically them's dueling words. You're in trouble if you call someone one of those insults. My favorite is puppy. Hardly seems like a harsh insult, but if you call someone a puppy, you're dead. You're going to be out on a dueling ground with a gun in the very near future. Other ones are a little less dramatic: scoundrel, rascal, and the worst of all possible insults, liar. If you call someone a liar, basically that's almost as good as a challenge. Interestingly enough, in this political population, there was one extra insult that non-political duelists, like Southern duelists, also did not like to be called puppies. But there was one extra insult that national politicians could not abide, and that was self-interested politician. You call someone a self-interested politician, and that's a good way to provoke a duel, and it happened all the time. Let's say I wanted to provoke a duel with someone, I would say to Mr. Smith, you are a self-interested politician. And Mr. Smith has only one possible response: you're lying. At which case I get to challenge him to a duel and do what I wanted to accomplish, redeem my reputation, have a nice little affair of honor. Which brings me actually to an important point about these duels. One would always assume, of course, I assumed before this project, that the purpose of a duel is to kill. I mean, why else would you be standing 10 paces away from someone pointing a gun at him and having a gun pointed at you? But actually, the point of a duel was to risk your life in the name of your honor. Killing had nothing to do with it, and as a matter of fact, if you killed, that made you very vulnerable. That made you seem as though you were a bloodthirsty, evil, murderous fiend of a killer. So if you look at all the duels in the period among politicians, the ones who kill usually end up in dire shape, and Aaron Burr is maybe the best example of this. He's basically on the lam after he kills Hamilton, and his career sort of never quite recovers from his duel with Hamilton. So basically, duels are ways really to redeem your reputation. There's a whole code and there are words that appear all the time in congressional debate that people just haven't tracked, that makes congressional debate look very different. There's a chapter on print weapons, how people attacked each other with newspapers and pamphlets and letters. And when you look very closely at how they're attacking each other, you discover that each form of print had a different audience, and that when a politician chose one or another of these forms of print, I'll attack him in a letter, no, I'll attack him in a pamphlet, they assumed that they'd be sending a certain message with that particular choice of a print genre. There's a great letter that I discovered at the very beginning of this project that not only revealed to me a lot about print objects, but really showed me a lot about this whole grammar of combat that I'm talking to you about now. James Monroe, at least a friend of Jefferson, so he's sort of related, was insulted by John Adams when John Adams was president, actually. John Adams gave some kind of a public talk, and he insulted James Monroe, and James Monroe was wounded by this, felt his honor had been assailed, and he needed to do something to redeem himself. So he wrote a long letter to James Madison, basically ticking off his options. What can I do to fight back? And it's a fascinating letter because he basically lists the available weapons of combat. And he says, number one, well, I could write a pamphlet. Pamphlets need a lot of evidence. I could write a pamphlet and attack him back, except I've written one once before and it didn't seem to do much, so I don't think a pamphlet's going to serve me very well in this instance. I could go to the newspapers, but they're really ephemeral. They don't seem to have a big impact, and in this case, I really need something that's going to wow them, so I don't think newspapers are going to be the way to go. He then says, remarkably enough, I could challenge him to a duel. Now, this is the President of the United States, I will mention, that he's talking about. But then he has a second thought and he says, no, he's an old man and the president. Wise thinking on the part of Monroe. And ultimately he decides actually to hold back and see what will happen, and essentially nothing happens, and his reputation doesn't suffer very much, and the situation sort of calms itself. But that's the very sort of letter that set me off on this project in the first place, because there you can see he has a very clear sense of different weapons and a different logic for using them. Two other chapters. There's a beginning one I didn't want to start with because it probably would seem a little bit out there before my explaining some of the more solid ones. But the first chapter of the book brings you into this world of national politicians and shows you how even in the way that they dressed, in the way that they were presenting themselves, they were expressing their politics. In other words, I found a wonderful diary by a very cranky Pennsylvania senator named William Maclay. And Maclay wrote everything down. His dreams, what he had for dinner, he heard someone whisper, his wig needs to be dressed. He wrote it down. He wrote everything down. And what he reveals in this wonderful diary is, as he's looking around at his colleagues in Congress and as they're looking at him, they're judging each other's politics based literally on their appearance and manner. So, for example, if you have a carriage, you want to be careful about how many horses you decide to have with your carriage. Too many horses and you're going to seem very monarchical, and that's a bad thing. Too few and you're not going to really seem properly elite. So you have to really manage to have a Republican, small r, the politically correct number of horses. And sounds kind of crazy, except there's actually an exchange of letters in which someone writes, a Virginian writes to George Washington and says, that John Adams, he has 6 horses. We hear about that down here in Virginia, 6 horses, highly inappropriate. And Washington writes back this sort of sad little letter in which he says, well, Mr. Adams is rather high-toned, but he actually only has 4 horses. Which makes the situation much better, clearly. Now, Adams, who's not a shy man, is not at all thrilled with the fact that his politics are being questioned because of the number of horses that are attached to his carriage. And so he writes this very sarcastic letter in which he says, not only do I have the proper amount of horses, but I walk more in the street than any other congressman, and I am thus the most virtuous man of them all. Clearly not taking it very seriously. But again, even that idea, walking in the street, is something that's politically correct. It makes you seem like you're willing to be there in the muck among the rest of the people. Washington, who was very savvy about all of this sort of symbolism, every afternoon at roughly 2 o'clock in the afternoon, George Washington strolled around the block for no other reason than to be seen strolling around the block. And he got fan mail for doing it. People wrote him from other states, great idea, the walk. We love it down here in Virginia. So these sorts of things had a real impact, or a quite amazing political impact. And so this first chapter really talks about the code of just behavior and dress and what it is, how do you act and look like a Republican, small r, Republican politician. The last chapter gets us to Aaron Burr. I didn't initially intend to have him close off the book, but he sort of put himself forward as a logical choice. The last chapter talks about the presidential election of 1800 and really looks at it as a case study of all the other weapons I've been talking about, all in use in one big mess in that presidential election, which was indeed a very big mess. And those of you who aren't familiar with the story of it, there ends up being a tie between Aaron Burr and Thomas Jefferson, who are both of the same party, which is not necessarily what they would have called it, but they're both Republicans, and Burr was supposed to be the vice presidential candidate, but in this period there was no vice presidential sort of separate ballot. Basically, you just voted, and whoever got the most votes was president, and whoever got the second most votes was vice president, and there it was. So in this case, they ended up with a tie vote, and this ends up being a massive, massive mess. Burr doesn't step forward and say, no, I'm not supposed to be president. Mr. Jefferson, please, after you, I will step back and be what I was intended to be, which is vice president. He doesn't step back. He just remains silent, which Jefferson never forgives him for, never trusts him again. And this moment, actually, even more than the duel with Burr, this is sort of the death moment of Burr's political career, because Jefferson and his friends never trust Burr again. Burr referred to them ever thereafter as the Virginia Junto. They were just a gang of Virginians who were out to get him. But the chapter, in addition to showing all of these weapons in play in this election, looks at it through the eyes of Aaron Burr. Aaron Burr wrote his memoirs in his last couple of years. And one of the main points, basically his memoirs, they're fascinating because Burr is not someone who is known for his political ideals or ideas or principles or actually his politics at all. He was really an opportunist. And his memoirs are organized, they're divided basically into 3 sections, which as far as I can tell are Guys I Hate by Aaron Burr. George Washington, Alexander Hamilton, Thomas Jefferson. And there are his memoirs. And he just goes from one guy I hate to the next guy I hate, and it fills 2 volumes, actually. He hated them a lot. But the main point of the volume is that underneath all of these horrible things and these guys I hate behaving horribly towards me, the worst of all is Thomas Jefferson and this election of 1800. Because Jefferson claimed ever thereafter that Burr was corrupt, that Burr had done some nasty finagling at the last minute to try and become president, and it sort of was on Burr for the rest of his life. He couldn't quite brush off that charge. Burr says in his memoirs, no, actually, Jefferson was the one who negotiated and cheated his way into the presidency. Now, of course, who would believe Aaron Burr? Not very many people would believe Aaron Burr, and clearly his memoirs were not a bestseller, so not even very many people even bothered to read what Aaron Burr had to say. But what I show in this chapter is basically, if you understand the politics of the period and you understand all of the subtle sort of seemingly apolitical ways in which these guys are politicking, you discover that actually Jefferson did make something of a deal. Now, this is where I'm really going to be struck by lightning, I can tell. I discovered actually a legal deposition, which apparently hasn't been used very much before, by someone who was involved in that election, the ending of that election, trying to break the tie. And there's one line in that deposition that just reveals a lot. Essentially, there's a moment in this election. It's tied, it's tied, it's tied. They vote 35 times in Congress to break the tie, and they can't. And they think there's literally going to be civil war. There are guys arming in Pennsylvania and Virginia to seize the government for Jefferson if he doesn't get it. So this is actually rather serious. And Federalists keep going up to Jefferson and saying, we'll vote for you if you'll just do these 4 things. And they have, 4 things that they want, like don't take apart the Treasury Department, don't destroy commerce. They're sort of goofy things, but they want Jefferson to promise, basically, that he's not going to tear apart everything that they've built up over the last 10 years. And Jefferson keeps saying, as you think he would, I will not be bound by any promises. I will not enter office on any sort of promise. I can't do it. The last minute, things are looking very bad, and a friend of Jefferson goes to visit him, the fellow who made out this legal deposition, and he says, those Federalists are really pretty persistent about these 4 issues, and I don't know what to do. And Jefferson says, well, I won't be bound by any promises. I will not enter this office to be bound by any promises. I will not do it. And then there's a pause, and then he says, but friend to friend chatting around the dinner table, I can talk to you about the issues in those questions. And he then goes 1, 2, 3, 4, talks about each of the 4 issues, not only says to this fellow what he would do about them, but even gives him footnotes, basically. Look in notes on the state of Virginia, page 5, where it says, so he basically offers this guy a little script on what to do to go back to the Federalists. He has not made a deal, and so he said for the rest of his life, I made no deal, because he was just chatting with a friend. However, Burr then has some reason to claim that he did make some kind of a deal. That's the wonderful thing about this sort of dinner table politicking, is that it's very slippery and seemingly invisible. And in this case, really allowed Jefferson to do something that he could honestly deny for the rest of his life, but again, a questionable moment that you would never notice unless you understood all of these other aspects about the politics of the period. So that gives you at least a sense of what I'm doing, which is really a very new way of looking at national politics, really rediscovering the political narrative that we thought everything has been said about and it's all dead and gone. I'm really discovering a lot of new stories and a very new way of doing political history and the history of this period. Thank you.